Turkish soldiers are killed as fighting intensifies for the last piece of Syria held by opposition rebels. Hundreds of thousands of refugees are caught in the middle. Are hopes fading for a peaceful end to nearly 9 years of war? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Darren Jordon. Syria's government is stepping up its campaign to retake the last rebel-held province. On Monday, 5 Turkish soldiers and a civilian became the latest to be killed by shelling on Idlib in the northwest. Turkey backs opposition groups and had sent reinforcements to counter President Bashar Al Assad's offensive. Syria's main ally, Russia, is blaming Turkey for not coordinating its troop movements. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says his forces retaliated by hitting Syrian military targets and killing up to 35 soldiers. And he had this warning for Moscow.
We told Russia, you are not our counterparts here. It is the regime, so don't try to stand in our way. It's not possible for us to remain silent when our soldiers die. We will continue to hold them to account for this. Those who test Turkey's determination to such vile attacks will understand their mistake.
Meanwhile, civilians are caught in the middle. The UN says the fighting in Idlib has displaced 390,000 people since December. Many want to cross the border into Turkey, but Ankara says it can't take any more Syrian refugees. So let's break down what's happening in Syria. The war began mainly between forces supporting President Bashar Al Assad and rebel fighters who oppose his rule. But other countries soon got involved. Assad is backed by Russia and Iran. His troops now control almost 70% of Syria. The battle for Idlib could tip the balance in his favour. It is supposed to be one of the de-escalation zones agreed by Russia, Iran and Turkey that back some of the rebel groups. Kurdish fighters control around 30% of Syria in the northeast. Turkey says they're terrorists and launched an operation against them in October. And Ankara coordinated with Russia to create what it calls a safe zone there to resettle Syrian refugees. So let's bring in our guests. Joining us in the studio is Marwan Kabalan, Head of Policy Analysis at the Arab Centre for Research and Policy Studies. In Istanbul, on Skype, Matthew Bryza, a former White House official and US diplomat. And in Moscow, Glenn Diesen, Professor of International Relations at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Welcome to the programme. Matthew Bryza in Istanbul, let me start with you, if I may. I mean, we know that Ankara has been sending reinforcements to Idlib to counter a Syrian government offensive there. How significant is this attack then on these Turkish troops? And are we likely, do you think, to see an escalation in the violence with a Turkish response?
Well, it's extremely serious from the Turkish government's perspective. I mean, this is 6 people that were killed, largest loss in a clash with Syrian regime forces that I can recall. But in terms of escalation, I actually don't think we're likely to see much because the Assad regime does not want an all-out conflict with Turkey. Turkey does not want to get bogged down in a military conflict with the Assad regime. And Turkey is having to be extremely careful about how it deals with Russia, with whom it has worked for so long, with Russia and Iran on the so-called Astana peace process in Syria, and with whom Turkey has such extensive economic relations. So with Moscow backing the Assad regime, there's certain limits to how far Turkey can go. So my sense is that President Erdogan wanted to send a signal to the Assad regime and to Moscow, stop these attacks on Turkish troops. He has claimed 30 to 35 Syrian forces were killed. The Syrian Observatory of Human Rights has claimed a much smaller number, 5. So that would suggest that President Erdogan is signaling here. And I would guess for the moment, the situation will de-escalate.
So let's put that to Glenn Diesen there in Moscow. Glenn, I mean, Russia and Turkey signed that de-escalation deal for Idlib back in 2018, but that deal has been frequently violated. And now Turkey's president has warned Russia, look, don't stand in the way of Turkish retaliation. So how is Moscow likely to view the incident between Turkey and its ally Syria?
Well, I would agree with the argument that this is unlikely to escalate, primarily because both Russia and Turkey both have put a high priority in terms of this partnership they've been developing. So Moscow would not like to see the Syrian government keep moving forward on this. That being said, I very much doubt that targeting of Turkish troops was deliberate. Rather, they've been fighting these jihadi groups who reside in Idlib. But in terms of this agreement you're referring to, which is the Sochi agreement from September 2018, this was signed with the assumption, with putting the specific commitments upon Ankara to separate between the terrorist groups and the moderate rebels for the purpose of the Assad government and Russia as well to be able to negotiate some kind of a end to this with the moderates. Now, Turkey has not done this yet, and for this reason, this has been a big motivation behind the recent intensification of the conflict, primarily because Idlib becomes a staging ground to attack both the Syrian governments as well as the Russian presence there.
So let's just bring in Marwan Kabalan here in the studio. Marwan, so Turkey says it's retaliated against Syrian targets and has warned Moscow not to get in the way. Put this incident briefly into context for us, Marwan. What does it mean on the ground?
Well, I think the Turks, in fact, they want, most likely, they want to draw a red line for the Russians and the Syrian regime because, Darren, don't forget, this is the last of the 4 de-escalation zones which have been agreed between Turkey and Russia back in 2017. But Russia, in fact, never honored that agreement, and they actually took them one by one, starting from the de-escalation zone around Damascus, and then they moved south towards Dar'a. They took it also from the opposition forces, and they moved north towards Homs. They took it, and this is the last of the 4 de-escalation zones. I think Turkey is very sensitive about this part, particularly this zone, because it's in the Turkish borders, and there is the probability that Turkey will be suffering because of the influx of Syrian refugees. The Turks are talking about something like 700,000 Syrians who have been driven out of their homes because of the recent military escalation by the Russians and the Syrian regime. So I think the Turks here, they want to tell them that this is something that we cannot actually take or accept without actually meaning that this will lead to further escalation between the two sides.
And that's an interesting point you make about the refugees. I'm going to bring back Matthew there in Istanbul. Matthew, so what is Turkey's game plan in Idlib? I mean, we know that President Erdogan does not want a fresh wave of Syrian refugees from Idlib as a result of the fighting between Syrian government forces there. But Idlib's not likely to hold it much longer, is it? Is Idlib going to fall, do you think?
Well, it certainly appears that the Syrian Assad regime and Russia are determined to essentially crush Idlib using the same approach that they used elsewhere in eastern Ghouta, in Aleppo, which is to target hospitals, target schools, destroy all the infrastructure, level the city to force the inhabitants to leave before the ground troops of the Assad regime move in. That was the strategy Vladimir Putin used in Grozny, in Chechnya, and as I said, it's what has been used now in Syria. Russian air support, and then the artillery bombardments and ground forces by the Syrian regime, and I think that's the end game. And it's a horrible tragedy and war crimes being committed, but I think Ankara really doesn't have the ability to stop this from happening. What Ankara has, what the Turkish government has, is a series of observation posts inside Idlib province that provide sort of a tripwire and a deterrent to the regime of Assad or the Russian government from moving too far. But eventually, those observation posts are going to be under increasing pressure, and President Erdogan will face a very difficult decision of keeping those troops in a terribly dangerous situation or evacuating them. So the end game is difficult.
So let's just put that point then to Glenn Diesen in Moscow. Glenn, I mean, the ongoing Syrian government assault on Idlib continues to be a point of conflict between Russia and Turkey. They support, of course, opposing forces. But Russia wants Syrian forces to take the last rebel stronghold as soon as possible, though, doesn't it?
Well, I think the Syrian government is more inclined to move ahead and continue because they've had capturing more and more cities and towns. So I think they would like to continue. I think Russia, because of its priorities of having good relations with Turkey, they will seek to slow this down and find some solution with Turkey. I would just like to make a comment on this idea that Russia's targeting civilians and hospitals on purpose. This wouldn't make much sense. This is to a large extent now become a conflict about the hearts and minds. So that's not just cruel; it would also be very stupid. So I would dismiss that as very crude propaganda. I don't think definitely Russia is not targeting any civilians. And if you look at how careful they have been now in Idlib compared to, for example, how the Americans incinerated Raqqa, I think. I think one shouldn't argue that Russia has gone after the civilians. That would make much sense to me, though.
Let's just bring back Marwan Kabalan here into the debate. Marwan, let's talk about the Sochi deal for a second, because that was critical, wasn't it? It was a huge win for Turkey's president. It paved the way for Erdogan to achieve his big strategic goals of moving Kurdish fighters from the border and clearing space, perhaps, for some of the 3.5 million Syrian refugees living in Turkey to go back home. These are big strategic goals for Erdogan.
Yeah, absolutely. I think both the Russians and the Turks, they managed actually to work out something, some sort of cooperation between them in Syria. We all know that without the cooperation with the Russians, Turkey wouldn't be able actually to take the Euphrates Shield area in the north of Syria. They wouldn't be able also to take on Afrin, another Kurdish area. And also there is the latest agreement between the two sides on the east of the Euphrates, when the Turkish army actually infiltrated into the Syrian borders a few months ago, when the US president announced that he will be pulling out from Syria. So the cooperation between the two sides actually paid dividend for both sides, because the Russians also benefited a lot from the Turkish support of the Asatana process, which is not only about military confrontation on the ground. It's also, there's a political element of that track or that process. I think here where the Russians might be jeopardizing a lot of their gains in Syria if they stop actually cooperating with Turkey, because at the end of the day, the Russians are very much interested in actually reaching a political solution to the Syrian conflict. They can't just go on like this, fighting for every inch of Syrian territories. Plus, Turkey, in fact, could complicate things a lot for the Russians if they decided to supply the Syrian opposition with lethal weapons. Lethal weapons means that heavy casualties will be sustained by the regime forces. And also, I mean, there is a possibility that the Turks might be also supplying the Syrian opposition if they feel like that, if they deem that necessary for their interest against even the Russian Air Force. And that is something nobody really wants, neither the Turks nor the Russians.
Yeah, Matthew Bryza in Istanbul, I see you nodding your head furiously there. I mean, this latest incident in Idlib does raise the question about the future of the Syria war. So what is Turkey's game plan here, particularly after signing the Sochi deal with Russia? It's quite clear that Russia and Turkey have pretty much carved up northeast Syria for themselves, haven't they?
Well, I'm not sure that's entirely accurate. I don't think that either the Russian government or the Turkish government are making a land grab here. I think that they have two different sets of interests that are not identical, but they sort of coincide. So to me, what's happening for Russia is two things. One, it seeks to reassert itself as a great power, as a Middle Eastern power, and that's been successful at doing it. And by the way, I mean, as we know, in northeast Syria, it's Russian troops replaced the U.S. troops on the ground when President Trump pulled back the U.S. troops. So that's one goal of Russia. The other goal of Russia, I think, is to keep on pulling Turkey away from the rest of the NATO alliance, and as well as European allies in the European Union. For Turkey, the goal is not to control the territory necessarily in northeast Syria or along the border. It's to push out the YPG, as they call a terrorist organization, and then to reconstruct northern Syria, and to, I think, win contracts for Turkish companies, and to stabilize that area with the future political governance of that region to be determined, I think, not by Turkey, but by some form of political process. So both sides, both Moscow and Ankara, are looking for a political way out.
So let's put that then, the whole issue of the Sochi agreement, to Glenn Diesen there in Moscow. Glenn, the Turkey-Russia alliance signed in Sochi was crucial, wasn't it? Because, as Matthew was saying, the agreement cemented President Putin as the main power broker in the region, and it boosts Putin's preferred outcome of the war, doesn't it? Which is allowing his ally, Bashar Al Assad, to regain more territory.
Yes, that's correct. But I would also point out that the Sochi agreement is not a permanent settlement in terms of accepting a frozen conflict in Idlib. Russia's final objective in Syria is nothing less than delivering victory for its ally, which is the Syrian government. And this entails establishing full sovereign control over its territory, and also for foreign troops who are occupying Syrian territory, so the Turks, the Americans, to eventually leave. So Idlib then has to come at some point back. Now, like I mentioned before, this Sochi agreement was intended as a temporary solution in order to separate the terrorists from the moderates, and also to reestablish this highway connection between Damascus and Aleppo. So I think, given that it's been a year and a half and both the Syrian government and the Russians have been attacked out of Idlib, I think that they deemed this as necessary to push back. However, I would agree with the former speaker that it's not. I see it unlikely as Russia being interested in going for full military victory right away in Idlib. I think rather chipping away a few towns and finding a new agreement is the best approach forward, in which they actually have a lot in common with Turkey in terms of interests.
Let me just move the debate forward quickly and just talk about what this all means for the Kurds. Marwan, Kabalan, when President Trump dramatically withdrew US forces from northeast Syria, did he pretty much throw the Kurds under the bus? I mean, the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, were crucial in helping to defeat ISIL, and this Trump decision left the Kurds in complete shock.
Absolutely. Initially, he did actually throw them under the bus, but I think the Pentagon was a little bit more reserved about this approach. This is why I think President Trump decided to keep some U.S. troops in the east part of Syria, under the pretext of protecting the oil fields in order not to be fallen again at the hands of ISIL or be actually taken by the Syrian regime. Right now, I think the Americans are still very much into this game. Turkey position will be very much affected also in this confrontation with the Syrian regime, and by extent with Russia, on how much support they are going to get from the Americans. It's really important for the Turks that the Americans support them in any prospect of future confrontation with the Syrian regime and the Russians. Without that support, I think the Turks will be thinking back with the incident when they brought down that Russian jet in 2015. So I think the Americans are still very much there, and the Turks would want actually to see the Americans supporting them somehow in order to stop this attack by the Syrian regime and its Russian backers. And I agree with both of your speakers actually that the immediate objective of the Syrian regime right now is to control the main roads between Hama, Aleppo, and Latakia, Aleppo, the trade routes.
Matthew, let's just stay with the Kurds for a second here, because that deal that Russia and Turkey signed in Sochi pretty much ended any hope of Kurdish political autonomy. I mean, this was a win-win for President Erdogan. He got rid of US-backed SDF forces, and he got Kurdish fighters to give up ground on the border, didn't he?
Yeah, he sure did. And, it's important to keep in mind when we talk about Kurds in Syria, the YPG and its political affiliate, PYD, they don't represent all Syrian Kurds, right? So from Ankara's perspective, these are terrorist organizations. And in fact, it was then Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter a few years ago in the US Senate who admitted that while testifying in the Senate. So from Ankara's perspective, this group, the YPG, needed to be pushed away from the border because it's a terrorist group. But as I was saying before, what comes next is not that the Kurds writ large as an ethnic group will be banished from northern Syria. This is where they live. So the question is, how will they decide how to govern themselves in the context of what both Russia and Turkey wish, which is to maintain the territorial integrity of Syria? And the answer to that question is not clear, but there are many different Syrian Kurdish political groupings well beyond the one that the Turks view as a terrorist one.
Yeah, Glenn Diesen there in Moscow. Glenn, I mean, once Russia had signed that Sochi deal, I mean, Moscow had warned Kurdish fighters to withdraw from the Turkey-Syria border or be crushed by the Turkish army. So as far as Russia was concerned, were the Kurds expendable? I mean, one Russian official said they'd been abandoned and betrayed by the Americans.
Yeah, well, I guess the Kurds hasn't had best treatment by any of the major players in this conflict. So obviously, not just the Americans on this, but I guess for Russia, in terms of seeking some settlement with Turkey, because for Russia it's trying to be the fair broker in the region and essentially try to get along with every major power. So it is a bit of a problem there how to organize this with Turkey in terms of not having a very zero-sum outcome where the winner takes all. So I guess for Russia, they had more flexibility in the north in terms of recognizing some of Turkey's security concerns about these Turkish groups along the borders. Where, again, I think there it would be more in common, easier to accommodate Turkey. The main problem is, of course, Idlib, as this can't continue the way it has been now.
Let's just quickly talk about the humanitarian crisis in the conflict. Matthew Bryza, the UN estimates nearly 400,000 people have been displaced by the fighting in Idlib just in the last 2 months alone, Mark Yu. I mean, given that Turkey is a major player here, how does Turkey view the suffering and the refugee crisis? Just very briefly.
Well, as we all know, Turkey is hosting 3.6 million refugees from the conflict already. And until recently, this wasn't really a political issue. I think in Turkish society, the sense was if people in need knock on your door, you take them in. Well, now, though, social media and political organizations in general are starting to sense the social stress. So Turkey, yes, is keeping the border closed. It's worried about these 300, 400, 500,000 more refugees trying to get into Turkey. And I think President Erdogan has been playing this refugee card with the European Union, threatening to reopen the floodgates, if you will, and allow refugees to begin moving from Turkey into Greece and onward into the EU, unless the EU participates in rebuilding northern Syria and financing the reconstruction.
Marwan Kabalan, I mean, the humanitarian situation in Idlib is appalling, is it not? I mean, yet many people say, look, the UN Security Council has repeatedly failed the people of Syria in providing desperately needed aid and holding all sides accountable for alleged war crimes. What's your view, just very briefly?
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely right. I mean, the whole world actually has failed the Syrian people because this war should have been stopped from its early stages. It has been going on for the past 9 years. And I wonder, actually, your guest from Moscow said that President Putin might succeed, in fact, in delivering victory for his ally in Damascus, but he will never succeed in finding a political solution to the Syrian conflict without the cooperation of other parties.
So you win the war and lose the peace.
Turkey, this is one. Number two is he will never be able to rebuild the country because he will be needing also the cooperation of the West, the United States, Europe, and the Gulf states, as well as Turkey. So this is something that needs a teamwork rather than someone delivering a victory for us.
All right, let me quickly put that humanitarian issue to Glenn Diesen. Glenn, I mean, last month, Russia and China blocked the renewal of the mechanism established through the UN Security Council that would have allowed aid from Syria's neighbours into areas controlled by the opposition. Russia faces allegations that it's worsening the humanitarian crisis.
Well, they take a different position here, though. They're also concerned about, this rearmament of these terrorist groups. So again, over the past weeks when they liberated new cities, they have found a lot of weaponry and a lot of this seems to come from the West. So there is this concern that humanitarian corridors are used to arm these terrorist groups. Now, that being said, obviously this humanitarian crisis is a big consideration when they make the decisions. And I would also add that it's not in Russia's interest either to have hundreds of thousands of people flooding towards Turkish borders, which would not be good for Turkey, Europe, or Russia, of course.
Matthew Bryza, very briefly, a final thought. How do you see an end to the war? Very quickly.
I see the Syrian regime trying to crush Idlib, recapture all that territory. And then, for years, there's been the discussion about a constitutional process to create a transition regime. That seems so far-fetched right now with all this horrible suffering, though. It's really hard to reach into the future.
All right, gentlemen, so much to talk about, so little time. Thank you very much indeed. Our guests, Marwan Kabalan, Matthew Bryza, and Glenn Diesen. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/ AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Darren Jordon, and the whole team here, goodbye for now.